right, let's get into this listener question from John that we have today, which is all about the episode theme is preparing to sell, renovate or walk away. And thanks to Cate in particular for your prep for this episode. So John asks us whether it's worth renovating before selling, especially when the buyer might knock the house down anyway. Sadly, John witnessed the hard work his father had put into their weatherboard when they went to sell, only to find it sold to someone who decided to knock it down and rebuild a reproduction French provincial style home. And yeah, I must admit that kind of thing is pretty common around where I live. So it is interesting and a little bit sad to hear that, some people go in thinking that perhaps the house they've owned for decades and they do a bit of work to it and hoping someone will pick it up and love it, ends up knocking it down. I can imagine how that could be quite emotional. Cate, I'm sure you see this quite often as well. How often do you see vendors pour time and money into renovations that don't actually add value?
Yeah, incredibly, Dave. It's very common. And John's example is textbook. But it doesn't mean that the work didn't translate into a good sale price either, because an emotional owner-occupier who loved the works and the house might have bid up the price only to lose to the winning bidder. But what people often forget is that effort doesn't always equal value either. The market doesn't reward sweat equity, it rewards buyer demand. And in particular, a vendor needs to know what the general buyer pool, particularly the cashed up, motivated buyers, what they want in their area. And when it comes to decor and presentation, that's really important to understand. If they get it wrong, they can spend time and money on something that doesn't give them any return on investment. And, there's something to be said for a blank canvas. Sometimes when a property is an obvious renovator or knockdown, you're better off leaving it to the buyer's imagination. You're likely to be attracting people that are imaginative and are thinking about change. It's when the house isn't an obvious knockdown or renovator that you need to paint the picture and, dress it up and style it. So I think understanding which camp it sits in is the first step, Dave.
It's a good question, isn't it? And I think that's the biggest risk, right? You do the work and then it gets demolished anyway. But I think it depends on where we are in the economic cycle as well. So right now, construction costs or let's just say the availability of trades is not like it was pre-pandemic. So the likelihood of people coming in and doing a renovation on the cheap is not necessarily there. And I suppose you could look at the type of dwelling it is and does it fit with the neighbourhood and the streetscape, and if it doesn't, then there's a chance that it's going to be knocked down. So there's a few moving parts to it, but I suppose from a numbers side, it is where sellers can really hurt themselves, spending that money assuming that they're going to get that return in the sale. And obviously if you're spending $1, you want to be getting a dollar times a little bit of a margin, but the return isn't always there, and it can reduce their net outcome once they factor in the time and the holding costs and just the stress of renovations, whether you're doing it yourself or you're engaging somebody else. They don't always go super smoothly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I must admit it's something, we see all the time. We're talking with clients who are planning on selling a property and then they almost always want to do some renovations, and you actually get to see how much they plan to spend, how much they do spend, and how much it changes the actual sale price relative to what they estimated it to be worth. And I would say more often than not, just the pure cost they spend on the renovation, the property doesn't increase in value by that amount. So we have lots of conversations with people about really probably simplifying what they plan to do when, they spruce up their house for sale, because there is a huge emotional temptation to overcapitalize at that point in time. So this sort of leads us into the next question. That should come before any renovation starts. And that point should be when the seller stops and asks, am I renovating for myself and or for the market, which, we often, as I just touched on, see people, they're often renovating for themselves. What's your experience, Kate?
Yeah, absolutely that. I've seen so many people do it, and I'm glad my mum and dad don't listen to this show because they did it. The question should come before any renovation starts. If the motivation is emotional, or it's based on pride or guilt, or even just a sense of finishing things properly, that's a bit of a red flag. Once you're selling, the best thing that you can do psychologically is picture it just as a product, not your home anymore. You've got to be forward thinking. Think about your next move, your next lifestyle. Very hard thing for someone to do. But if you can look at it objectively, it's no longer your home, it's a product. You'll fare a lot better. I remember many years ago when my mum and dad sold our family home, and in their defence, that was my dad's super, essentially. He was in a small business and didn't have superannuation, and they were planning on doing a downgrade and downsize, so moving into a cheaper area and getting a smaller house and putting the proceeds into super, and they've done that and successfully. But at the time, they were advised by their agent to make a few changes, and they didn't want to. They'd built this house back in 1979, 1980, and they just, really wanted to showcase all of its, its special elements that dated back to then. And of course, they were told to pull up the flooring in the kitchen and put down floorboards. They were told to, modernise things, paint a lot of stuff white, get rid of the tiles that were dating it. And they didn't want to. And someone bought the house for a pretty good price. I think it was a tougher sale because, this was a house that looked like it stepped straight out of 1979. And the first thing these people did was everything that was recommended to my parents. And then they sold it only about a year later and made a huge profit. And I know that would have been a really hard thing for my parents to bear. But they were feeling emotionally about the property, and they didn't want to dress it in a way that would have appealed to the market. And they were viewing some of these recommendations as cheaper products and cheaper finishes, and they probably were, but it would have got the sale price up. So yes, being able to emotively disengage and then look at it just as a product, that's when the sale will serve you better.
It all sort of comes back to emotions, doesn't it? I mean, we all have them, although I've met some people that there's a question. But we want the new purchaser to be emotional, but we don't want to make emotional decisions ourselves, right? So that's where I think we've really got to be careful, because those emotionally driven renos are almost always financially inefficient. If you can't clearly explain how the renovation is going to improve the campaign, the buyer appeal, and more importantly, the end price, then it is probably worth rethinking that as a strategy.
100%. That's how we have our conversations with clients. We'll break down each thing they plan to do with the renovation when they're targeting it up to sell, and go, okay, what do you plan to spend here? What return do you think you're going to get on that action? Okay, what do you plan to spend there? What return do you think you're going to get? And go through each item, because I find when you go through things one by one, it's easier to sort of get clear on, well, maybe you're spending too much in this space. That isn't necessary, and you could just do, 50% of what you plan to do there. You'll, obviously save 50% of the cost, and you can really, I think, strip back what people plan to do when it comes to selling, when they're tarting up a property, so they just don't overcapitalize. And also, like we've talked about, the emotional drain that an effort they can go into, they're already pretty stressed often when they're looking to sell. They're trying to decide agents they may or may not have purchased. They're working through finances. It's just another thing that if you can simplify it for them, help them not put so much time and effort into it, it's a way you can actually help them reduce their stress during what is quite a stressful time, obviously, when we're selling and we're usually buying property at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So John's parents had a period where they bought home that was later knocked down. And look, I know where I live, you could drive around the street. There's some in our street, which you almost certainly, they're probably the last two houses in the street that haven't had major renovations. Their original, weatherboard properties, they're going to be knocked down. You can guarantee it. But you can see in this case, there was probably, John's parents were hoping that someone would come and love it. But so you want to sort of have some awareness about what's going to happen to your property. Cate, how can sellers work out whether their home is likely to attract renovators, rebuilders, or owner-occupiers?
Yeah, you look at the land, the street, the surrounding activity, also the zoning, the overlays, and the council restrictions. That's a big part of it because, Dave, you're talking about your neighbourhood. I know exactly what you mean. You've got lots of those French provincial mansions around you. I haven't and I won't, because the Maribyrnong City Council have recognised that there are some really beautiful turn of the century, I'm talking 1900s homes in Yarraville that deserve to be protected. And, I could query what's going on in Borrandara and why they're allowing it, but that's taking us into a political conversation. Council restrictions play a huge part in this. And because something's heritage doesn't necessarily protect it, but it makes it a bit harder for a developer to knock it down. And if neighbouring homes are being rebuilt, if the block is large, if the value is in the land, a huge amount of value is in land as a percentage, then that's your clue. We've talked about land to asset ratio before. If something's close to 100 and it hasn't got a heritage overlay on it, you've got to anticipate there might be a chance of it getting knocked down. In those cases, the buyers are buying the site, not your kitchen. We haven't touched on social and cultural values yet either, but we have a lot of cashed up buyers who are not Australian born who really value new. And I've seen some stunning homes, I've seen some not so stunning ones, but in the really high caliber blue chip areas, if we've got cashed up, I won't say new arrivals because some of these families have been here for decades, but if their cultural value is that they want a new property, well, then they'll do it. And if you're looking at a location where you've got, a particularly high number of non-Australian born, particularly from one country, you might find that, you've got a community there, you've got a higher likelihood of lots of these houses being knocked down. So, one case in point, and it's easy for me to draw on this, the Chinese market in the leafy eastern suburbs of Melbourne, we're seeing a lot of development, not just Chinese. I know that Indian families love new as well, and they're not on their own. We've got lots of different cultures that appreciate new more than, and some of them absolutely don't want weatherboard and don't want the old properties. So we don't just have to pay attention to the land and the council restrictions. We also have to look at the community and what they value.
I'm glad that question about owner-occ versus investor came up, because that's a big consideration for the depreciation deductions on the property. So, for example, if it's an owner-occupier, they can't claim any depreciation deductions. If it's an investor, they can. And the rules changed on the 9th of May 2017 for the renovations done by that previous owner. Sorry? Oh, yeah, 7:30 p.m.
I love it.
So if you exchanged contracts at 7:31 on the 9th of May 2017, new rules, and if it was 7:29, your old rules, it's just a bit of a weird nuance of the fact that that's the exact time that the then Treasurer, Scott Morrison, stood up in the House of Reps to deliver that budget in 2019. Of course, nobody really cares about that, but it was a big night for me because it changed things quite a lot. And I think depreciation maybe back then was not, the knowledge around it was not as good as it is today. And some investors will understand it, some won't. But let's just say, for example, you do a huge kitchen and bathroom renovation, maybe you spend $100,000 on it. Anything that's plant and equipment, you won't be able to claim those deductions if you're the new purchaser, even if they are brand new. If you look at the legislation, it says you either have to pay for it or have first owned it when it was first installed, ready for use. So the fact that it could be a day old actually still can make it a second-hand asset. So it means that we only have the structure. So sticking with that example, kitchen and bathroom, in a kitchen, the structure is really the kitchen cabinetry. It could be the flooring. If you're doing the roof, it's those sorts of things, the bench tops. But the plant and equipment items will be cooktop, oven, range hood, or it could be a stove and a range hood. In a bathroom, the plant and equipment items are going to be bathroom accessories, spa bath pumps, heat lights or the IXL Tastic or exhaust fans, and then you can sometimes have heated towel rails as well. So the majority of it would be structure. If we're spending 100 grand on a kitchen and bathroom renovation, you might say, well, $85,000 to $90,000 would be structure that you can claim as the new owner. But the plant and equipment items, even though they're a lesser percentage of the total spend, they still sort of give roughly the same deductions because they're much higher depreciation rates. So, for example, carpet has a 25% depreciation rate, whereas the structure has a 2.5% depreciation rate. So if you're going and putting all these new plant and equipment items in, the old rules would be great, like an overcapitalized property is good for a new purchaser because, overcapitalized by definition means they spent too much. But that's the only time it's good, is when you buy an overcapitalized property and you don't pay a premium for it, you get those depreciation deductions. So that's got to be a consideration. If it is an owner-occ focusing property, the benefit of that renovation is not as big necessarily from a tax perspective, or there's no benefit compared to an investor. So that's something that I think maybe not a lot of people would know about. And I suppose we should also think about the distinction between the land value and the development potential versus the dwelling streetscape as well. And I sort of prefaced that in the beginning. You should be able to get a sense of whether it's going to be knocked down or not, as Dave's sort of sharing that example, in a location which is blue chip and there's some expensive homes, and then you've got some weatherboard, if you'll pardon the expression, shit boxes. Renovating them is a complete waste of time. So if the buyer is targeting the land, then that money spent on the house is probably going to go in the bin.
Yeah, 100%. And that's often what we see, certainly obviously around where I live, and perhaps not so much around Yarraville, but if you do have these period homes that are tired and it's clear they're going to be a knockdown, and people want to get into the location, they want to build something brand new, and so they're paying for the cost of the land, basically, plus probably a little bit of extra premium to get obviously that piece of land. They might factor in the cost of removing the property, knocking it down, etc. But yeah, it's a big consideration. Something we see often, we're working with people who are doing major renovations on their house, and they're often assuming the valuation will be current value plus the cost of the renovations they're going to put in place. And they might be basing their numbers around being able to borrow 80% of that. And so we have to temper their expectations to understand that the valuation won't always be your current value of your property plus your renovations. And, people are surprised by that. It might change how much they're able to spend. They mightn't have even thought about this, and they've got to this late stage of their building plans. So, like, for example, we're doing quite a major renovation at the moment, which we're living through, which could buy a very nice investment property, which, it certainly isn't lost on me most days of the week.
I think as it drags on, Dave, you're kind of thinking, geez, we should have got that investment.
Well, look, it's not the drag on, but it actually is the capitalisation. I would say possibly our property will appreciate by 50% of the value of our renovation. So that's just the reality, and I understand that's what's happening, and it's going to give us a lifestyle outcome. It's a big expenditure for a lifestyle outcome, but I guess that's what you do with 3 kids. But a lot of people don't go into their home renovations with these types of understandings, and it's much more simplistic. So their perspective. So that's where it really pays to make sure they're talking to, whether it's a buyer's agent, a strategic mortgage broker, a trusted advisor, and actually understanding these outcomes, how it might impact their ability to even fund the renovation. because it can mean they can't spend as much because they've overestimated the end value. So what improvements almost always make sense before selling, guys?
Yeah, I'd say presentation related improvements, paint, flooring, lighting, gardens, things that change how the home feels, not how it's built. And, sometimes these can give the impression that, a house is better than it actually is. And a building inspection will always help a buyer, decode whether the presentation improvements are covering up something. You can patch and paint and hide all kinds of things. But the idea behind presenting your home, it really is to try and remove the reasons for buyers to hesitate, not to necessarily impress them with design choices, but, to create a picture. And we all know someone who's a friend of the property trio, and he's very active on social media, but he's also very active in helping people sort out their homes for sale, and that's Pete Karaglanis. And he shares a lot of gold in his stuff, but he talks often about the basics of what he does. And, sometimes he's got to have that really difficult conversation with the vendor to have them let go of that colour scheme that meant a lot to them, or to be willing to have, a part of their house that they loved and enjoyed completely overhauled. But generally, it's about removing the barriers that can have a buyer look at the pictures and say, no, I'm not going to bother going and seeing that property. His job is to get them there. And then his job is to make sure that it shows it in a different light, and it gets them thinking about what it could be, and they can visualise themselves there. So, there's a lot of clever things that can be done. But to your point, Dave, you don't want to over-capitalise by doing anything that's, building related and structural related. You're tidying it up, giving it a facelift.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And PK is actually, it's another chance to flog and cross promote here, Cate. So for context, Dave, Cate, I interviewed this morning for Geared for Growth, and we talked about our investor night, or our live podcast. And PK is actually going to be in the room, and I've interviewed him on my Geared for Growth program before. And he talks about really simple things. They're normally low cost, high impact, and a lot of it is, what do you see when you pull up to the house? So it's things like pressure washing, it's the garden maintenance. Like, these aren't typically high expense things, but straight away it removes that feeling, that unconscious feeling like, oh, it's a bit shabby or it's a bit tired. And they might just be looking at, the edges, or might just be looking at the concrete that looks a little bit stained. These aren't expensive things to do. They're very easy to control from a budget perspective. And that kind of really de-risks when you're talking about high bang for buck type improvements.
I've got a specific example, and I'll detail what was done to the house so that our listeners can understand. I'm not just talking Pete up. I had a lovely client who wanted to sell a property for a family member of theirs that had passed away. And, the idea of getting this property ready for sale, it would have been a bit of a burden. But of course, they wanted to do the best that they could for their family member. And anyway, they tidied it all up and cleaned it and all the rest of it, and said to me, we'd really prefer to talk to someone about an off-market sale. We just, don't really want to go through all that rigmarole. So they chatted to an agent, and I was there as their phone a friend to guide them through the process. And the agent was great. He got the right qualified buyers through. They did their very best. And I thought the property was, worth more than 1.3, but unfortunately the offers that they were sort of getting, or the conversations they're having with buyers and where people were at, was closer to 1.2, and that would have been doing the house a disservice in my view. It just needed to have, a bit of a helping hand. So I recommended Peter, and they sat down and had a chat, and he scoped out all of the things that he wanted to do. And of course, you're looking at your presentation budget. You don't want to go overboard and then not recoup it in the sale. So we needed to make sure that it was a really cost-effective spend. But they ended up spending, from memory, close to $60,000, which is big. But there were a lot of things that needed doing. And, he started with the pressure washing. He worked with the kitchen that they already had. He didn't overhaul the kitchen, but absolutely tidied it up and, changed colour schemes and all the things that can be done when you're painting tiles and that kind of thing. And the pressure washing, had an enormous impact, but then lacquering the deck out the back, changing fixtures and fittings, new light fittings and handles and knobs and all of the stuff that
it's pretty superficial, not very expensive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Makes it look
and a
much
big
more
one,
presentable.
I think he nailed it with curb appeal, and that was probably where a bit of the money was spent. I mean, they painted the exterior of the house, they fixed up the fence, got gardeners in. It would all happen very quickly. You get a bunch of people in. It's like, one of those TV shows. Yeah, it was a bit like that. I wanted to see how this went at auction. And from memory, I've got to get the number right. I think it was something like 1.527.
Wow.
Massive return on investment.
Right. And I suppose that's the sort of property where you could have spent $200,000 on the reno. So 60 is a lot, but for that price point, that's where the ratio, like comparing that to say something that's worth $700,000, it's maybe a $20,000, $30,000 renovation.
Yeah, so that's like off the top, 4-ish%, give or take, of the end value of the property. And I don't think you'd want to go above 5%. You'd probably want to be around that 2 to 4% of the value of the property, I'd say.
But I look at the return on investment, cost him 60 to get an extra 320. That's a pretty good return.
It's a good deal.
Return. So do you want to, just with that, we've touched on why structural changes, you probably generally don't want to do them. They're much more expensive. Have you got any other examples or an example of what that, what some of those structural changes may look like or shouldn't look like?
Yeah, one of the biggest mistakes I've seen vendors make, even bigger than overcapitalising, is making structural or significant alterations themselves without permits. I remember seeing a house that presented really nicely on the surface, and I've been doing this for long enough. I can tell when something's not quite right, and this house was a bit NQR with some of its works. And I said to the agent, I can see that we've got varying degrees of expertise here with some of the finishing touches with the renos, but how do I know the bathrooms had a proper moisture barrier applied? How do I know these things are done well? Have you got permits? And he said, oh no, really good guy, he's got mates who are in the trade and blah blah blah. And I said, you're not answering my question. Are there any certificates or permits in this contract? And he said, oh no, not really. I had a chat with the vendor, and he was paying his mates in slabs of beer and helping them out in their places. Big issue for this vendor, because he did spend a bit, but he did it wrong. He didn't get all of the certificates, and some of the jobs were less than great. And that house not only languished, it eventually sold for a really disappointing price, and he would have completely overcapitalised plus some, because he was trying to sell a house with liability. And no buyer wants to take on liability. They don't want something that the council could come knocking and issue a show cause over. And that was the situation that he placed himself in.
Yeah. So
those structural ones, there is also a risk that once you start pulling things away, you can actually discover things that you didn't understand. And that's where we can see big cost blowouts. And we work with a few renovation style companies, and every now and then we have to cost things that just sort of got out of control, and really just try and it's really a loss prevention exercise at that point in time. And the structural things really generate a huge amount of value. It is a lot of those cosmetic things, and it might seem really simple, like things like new light fittings or just switches and door handles, but they're the ones that speak to us a little bit more emotionally. We overvalue those things compared to what they actually cost in the shopping trolley. One thing that I wanted to sort of talk about with you guys is that I don't like selling properties, but I've sold a couple, and one in particular I knew was going to be problematic with the building inspection. So it was a bit of an exercise in having an answer to every potential question that could come up, even a proactive building inspection that says, okay, this retaining wall, this drainage, that sort of stuff. So the agent had the ability to sort of say, well, they've done this mitigating thing, or they've approached it in this way, or this, that sort of has to be said by the building inspector, but it's not a big risk because they've done these sorts of things. Now, you can go too far, and knowing where to sort of draw that line is really, really important. But yeah, I wonder if you guys have seen any sort of proactive strategies like that that can actually not necessarily add value, but it stops taking the momentum out of that campaign because it becomes the talking point.
So Mike, you're basically saying, and this is a property you sold, you knew it had a few structural issues, there was a building inspection done, it raised a few points, but ultimately the agent, perhaps with you, was well coached on how to talk to each of those points so they wouldn't put off the vendors, hopefully at least, from wanting to still buy the property, because they understood there's some challenges there. There might be a little bit of extra work. They might put a price into that when they're purchasing the property, but they weren't massive sort of changes that were so hard to value that people wouldn't end up buying the property. That was
Yeah.
yeah. I think
Yeah, it was working with the agent.
Common, yeah.
Yeah, so we paid for a building inspection ourselves to get ahead of the potential objections that might happen. And of course, you can be upfront and you can say, look, the vendors have actually got a building inspection and this is what popped up and these are the things that they've done. Because I think we're talking about this.
There? You actually paid for your own? Yeah, good. Well, good idea. Yeah.
We're talking about this.
They have to.
Yeah. Well, I think that particular one was pre that legislation, but yeah. We thought of that as a strategy because I think we are talking about, firstly, making sure that it's not going to be knocked down because the whole thing is a waste of money, right? But also it isn't. Now, I'm going to dig myself out of this hole I've just created. But there's the concept of spending $1 to make $1.50 or $2, but there's also spending money to make that campaign run as efficient as possible and competition, right? So let's say the developer has to pay an extra $100,000 because there are emotional owner-occupiers that do see the value in those renovations. So ostensibly, those renos go in the bin, but that sale price is achieved a little bit higher because that developer had to stretch. Now, they just wanted the land, but they were forced to stretch because there are other people that it spoke to. So sometimes it's maybe less about, okay, how much extra can we get, but more about, well, how can we add as much heat to the campaign because we're fixing some of these issues that could be talking points as part of the ongoing negotiations with the potential buyers.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that communication is a key here. You know, we're talking about all of the angles that vendors can consider to get a better sale price. Having a really good story, and I'm not talking about a made-up story, I'm talking about a real story. Having a good story for an issue is great, and making sure that your agent is completely across it. So, for example, I'm looking at a property at the moment and there's a firewall out externally, and a few people have asked what's going on, and in the contract you can see that there was an insurance claim and talk about a fire. Well, the first thing I'm thinking is, gosh, fire damage and insurer, what's going on? Next door, with an adjoining wall, had a fire issue, and they were able to detail the fire and what happened, and where the party wall is and what it's all about, and then provide me with some documentation so that the story's not sinister, it all makes sense. So we're not spooked and walking away from the deal. I think that's another arm to consider when you're selling a property and you've got issues to explain.
Now, I was just going to ask you as well, buyer demand in that particular location, Kate, how do you feel like understanding where demand's coming from and what is popular in that suburb should actually drive these renovation decisions?
Yeah, totally. It's not just the dwelling type, it's what's happening in the location. Is it family friendly? Are they valuing, upmarket fixtures and finishes and even styling? You've got to understand that demographic and who's buying there now, not who bought there 5 years ago. So in a gentrifying location, that's a really important thing to understand. If you're looking at first home buyers, they're into trendy things and great furnishing and cool colours. If you're looking at families, they're thinking about space and utilisation. So yeah, it's really important to nail who you think your likely purchaser is.
And demand can be dynamic rather than static, right? Because a government could sort of say, oh, look, we've now got a first homeowner grant, so suddenly we've got more eyeballs on these particular types of suburbs, or it could be close to a transport corridor or a rail station, and now suddenly there's a permit to go to 15 stories where it was zoned residential before. So that's why I think that advice has to be time specific and it has to be local specific as well, right?
Yeah, 100%. You've got to be paying attention to what's changing your growth drivers and what's influencing, a particular segment of the market. And legislation and zoning changes and lending policy, all of those can have an enormous impact on who the cohort is that's buying in an area.
And I mentioned before I was interviewing you this morning on my show about Ballarat, and that's a really interesting case study because we were talking about, gosh, there is a sweet spot if investors do have a budget over, 700, 750 to be looking at some of these character homes. Now, of course, there's limitations on what you can actually do. Some of them are heritage listed, or some of them just have such a beautiful facade, you'd be crazy to touch it even if you're allowed to. So it sort of begs the question, in those types of ones, is it more about the maintenance than doing sort of the cosmetic stuff? Because you almost want it to look old?
Yeah, absolutely. You've just nailed it. I'd say without question, an older style home, it's really about maintenance and not so much selling the dream because it's already dreamy. It's warding off the nightmares. So buyers expect old kitchens, but they're far less forgiving with signs of neglect. And that's the biggest one: water damage, peeling paint, anything that looks expensive. They've heard so many horror stories and they've had so many people in the ear talking about older dwellings. So, any sign of anything potentially sinister will really rock their confidence. And, maintenance builds confidence, but at the same time, cosmetic fixes don't fix fear if there's a genuine concern about, a money pit.
And we were talking a little bit before about emotions, and fear, I think psychologists will agree, is a much more motivating factor than say the positive upside. We disproportionately run away from the stick than we go for the carrot. And so that anything that is in that buyer's mind that generates that fear or that perceived risk, I was talking about the campaign before. I mean, that is kind of a campaign killer, right? When you start having those conversations with multiple buyers going, oh, we're a little bit worried about this particular thing, or there's no permits for the reno, or the retaining wall looks a bit scary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen some really horrible efforts where vendors have, slapped white paint on everything internally and put in cheap hire furniture and plastic plants, and they're thinking that they'll draw a crowd. But if it's an older property and there's something that's obvious that it's going to cost a bit of money, it might even be, relating to flooring, unlevel flooring or rotted stumps or water damage, seedy bathrooms where no amount of sealant will take away the fact that there's water getting there in behind the tiles. They're things that any buyer will be a bit nervous about, let alone an experienced buyer or one with a building inspection. If there's obvious issues, they're the things that will chase buyers away.
We talked a little bit about your example with a renovation at that sort of over $1 million price point, and comparing that to something that might be worth $600 or $700. Obviously, there is a perceived idea that the cheaper property is more likely to be demolished because there's less of actual building value on that particular one, and it sort of begs the question: how does price point really motivate the renovation decisions? Obviously, if it's a $5 million property, $1 million reno isn't out of the question as having value. But if it's $1 million property, we're sort of talking about, you don't want to spend half the value, right?
Yes, of course. Look, entry-level buyers are way more price sensitive and happier to renovate later for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they'll have spent all of their savings on getting into the property, and they won't have savings left. All of that would have gone on deposit. And these days, with the 5% down deposit guarantee, we're seeing a little bit more accrued savings being able to be spent on some immediate updates. But typically, First home buyers will empty all their pockets and then they're just waiting for some equity growth because they're into the property and they've got nothing left to do the renovation. We tend to find first home buyers are the most jittery, and they'll be most likely to engage a building inspector. They're also most likely to jump at shadows too. So getting a great builder who can talk them through the issues is really important. They need to understand the fixes, how quickly the fixes need to be applied, and the likely spend for all of those fixes. I've seen too many first home buyers walk away from properties with some issues but nothing that they couldn't have overcome just because they're so very jittery. So having a good patient building inspector is important. And, you know, a line in the sand, of course, if there's too much there for them to take on or if it's too sinister, you walk away. But I've seen people jump at shadows. Prestige buyers, they certainly want turnkey and perfection, but even then, overcapitalisation risk can deter, you know, an experienced or sophisticated buyer. And at that level, they've had plenty of transactions before. They know people. They've got good people giving them advice. They will absolutely know if it's an overcapitalisation risk, and that could deter them as well.
And Dave, the higher the price point, the narrower the buyer pool, right? That's what I was sort of talking to Cate about a little bit this morning. If you can stretch to that slightly higher point, there's a lot less competition. But if we are talking about a higher price point with a lower buyer pool, issues are kind of amplified when the property sits on the market for a couple of weeks or months, you know, drifting down the page 2 of the search engine. You know, people sort of say the best place to hide a body is page 2 of the Google search results. And the perception of a stale or dud property is a real thing when a property sits on the market for too long.
Particularly at that higher price point, as you said, where there's less buyers. So everyone who has an interest will know that that property has been overpriced. So it becomes very clear, you know, if someone new becomes interested, they're going to know that no one was willing to pay that price. And so there's real risk for the vendor if they, if they get it mispriced when they begin the selling process. And then you can see, you know, and it's often recorded, these sort of high-end sales that have been sitting on the market for 6, 12 months, a couple of years, and then they finally sell and they get reported in the media, you know, for selling $1 million less than was originally asked, or, you know, even more with some of the really high-priced properties. So that certainly is a big risk. If a seller has limited time and budget, where would you say they should focus?
First impressions, starts and stops there. Street appeal, you know, how does the property look from the street? Like I was talking about before, that one that Peter got involved in, just cleaning things up, and sometimes it takes external painting or gardening or looking at the fences. Cleanliness is a big one. Lighting and fixing anything that's obviously broken. You know, if we think about the stuff that we walk past in our own home, get a third party to tell you what needs fixing. You want buyers thinking, this feels solid, rather than what's hiding here. I also highly rate staging furniture, and most people can't visualise a room without the furniture inside. You'd be surprised how many people buy an average property for a strong price just because of the way it's dressed. As a buyer's agent, I'm trained to see beyond that, but many can't. And the proportion of buyers that can't visualise, it's greater than 50%.
And you, Mike, what do you think a vendor should focus on first if they have a limited time and budget?
Well, I think Cate's nailed it with all of her points. It's the thing that we were talking about, you know, the driving up to the property, that curb appeal. Obviously, anything broken, anything that adds perceived risks or fear to the campaign is important. And we haven't really talked about staging because I suppose this is more of a renovation focus. But the value of staging is I think huge. And so if you're thinking about a certain renovation budget, you should also consider, okay, well, like we might need to factor staging into that. But over and above Cate's points, the budget is the thing that I kind of want to reiterate. It's so easy to sort of do a little bit and then you're like, oh, the front part of the house looks really nice. And then as we go back, it gets cheaper and cheaper and worse. And you start sort of chasing your tail, and things can get out of control really, really quickly. And what you think is nice or what you think is a finished product starts entering into your mind, but you've got to focus back on that. Well, what is the whole point of this thing? The whole point is to maximize the sale price. Yeah. And if we spend too much, we're eroding our own margins.
Yeah, don't make it about you. Speak to independent people, and whether that's the agent, whether that's a buyer's agent, mortgage broker, whoever it might be, but don't make it about what you want to do. Make it about independent parties' perspective, because they don't have that emotional attachment. All right, this has been a pretty lengthy episode, but so we'll just get to our final question. Cate, if sellers take one guiding principle from the episode to avoid wasted effort, what should it be? Or would you like this to be your gold nugget?
Yeah, I'll make it my gold nugget.
All right. So this is our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
Don't renovate for the buyer you hope for. Prepare for the buyer you're most likely to get, and don't underestimate the value of professional advice when it comes to staging.
My gold nugget, Dave, is really just to focus on the point of why we're doing this in the first place. So if there is a risk that it's just a land value play, then don't talk about renovations at all. If you have reasonable confidence, think about what is going to help the campaign, where you could potentially be spending $1 to get $2 back at the end sale price. It looks like we've lost Dave, and the astute amongst you listening in the middle might have realised I sort of took over Dave's host role for a moment. And this is the problem with renovations. Sometimes there's unintended consequences, like your internet not working.
Yeah, someone's cut his cable.
Yeah, but we should say a big thank you to John for that question. It's a really important one, and I actually kind of learned quite a lot from yourself and Dave on this one as well, Cate.
Well, it was a fun one. Good to chat with both of you, and I look forward to seeing you same time next week.
Beautiful. See you then.